This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. The show kicks off with K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien as he discusses the positive day in the market and what report expectations are. Justin Waggoner, K-State Extension beef cattle specialist, keeps the show moving as he highlights the importance of reflecting on your organization and understanding its culture. A weather update from K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond ends the show. He explains our recent above-average temperatures and if they'll hold on as we continue in November. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update from K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien. Daniel, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Daniel, yesterday, seeing a positive day in the markets, and what were we seeing price-wise?
Well, for the day prior to the report that'll come out today at 11, it was interesting in a way to see markets move to the higher side. We saw a decent corn, again, now the harvest futures contract for corn and the lead contract at the same time, up 7 cents to 442.5, and generally increases of about 6 3/4 to 6 cents all the way through July. Interesting that while D's 25 is at 424.25, you got D's 26 for the first new crop contract at 473.5, so about 31 cents higher. So that's some measure, I guess, of the degree of uncertainty that the market's at least valuing right now based on what could happen for crop uncertainty largely out into 2026. And soybeans also were up actually 12 cents for the November contract. Of course, the November contract is just about off the board. So we're really pricing cash prices off the January soybean contracts, lead contract. That was up 12.5 to 11.46, so almost to 11.50. These are all kind of benchmarks. 4.50 for corn you'd hope to be at least as a goal, and 11.50 for soybeans. So, and new crop November 26 is at 11.21.25. Interesting that that's lower than the current lead. The November contract's going off the board about 11.32. So interesting to watch that. And then for wheat, the D's contract was at 5.25, basically down 1/4%, pretty much sideways. You did see the March contract at 5.44, up 1/4. So really, not much in terms of change at all for the hard red winter wheat futures contract. Cash prices looking at were basically you did tend to see with the move higher in the futures with basis levels generally stayed about the same, and showed prices for corn now actually the top prices in all these locations that we follow all above $4. And last week when we talked about that wasn't the case. We had one or two above that. The top price, one single elevator, the top bid in an area, Garden City area, up to 429. And again, we were struggling to be above 4 not that long ago. Still a 13 under basis. And when under normal circumstances, we're about even money basis. So you can really see the impact of the harvest oversupply of local facility storage that's going on there. So again, 429 lead price in Garden City, 417 Pittsburgh, Kansas down southeast corner, northwest corner, but about 417. So interesting to see that, and the other prices elsewhere, again, Salina, Topeka, Hutchinson, all 402 to 407. So it's harvest time, and you've got some corn being sold, others being stored, etc. But right now is the time when we're stressing the capacity of storage in these areas, and so you see prices as they are. I would say for grain sorghum, we do see one or two places in the state amongst these elevators that we're following that have pretty strong bids. The one that stands out most notably would be in Hutchinson, one or two top bids of like $3.77 in that area. The next highest bid, $3.52 in Salina, 342 in Topeka, and then you got 337 Garden City, 327 in Pittsburgh and Colby. So when I see those South Central Kansas locations have some pretty decent bids relative to the rest of the state, then that's a signal that we're probably very likely looking at some elevators that are trying to position themselves to be involved in the export market. And we have heard some news stories of grain sorghum being bought, not in vast quantities yet. Again, the tying with China after the trade deal just concluded or in the process of being wrapped up between the U.S. and China. So we'll see where that all goes. Soybean bids. What's interesting is where we have no bids. There are no bids that I could see currently for soybeans around in the Garden City area. Now, as soon as I say that, we'll have 3 elevator calls and say, "Gosh, we've got bids right there." But at least I didn't see them on some of the news wires that I was looking at, newswire databases. Top bid in the state that I could find was in the Topeka area at 1077, 1067 in Pittsburgh. And again, you're not far from soybean processing facilities in both those cases. But then 1057 in Hutchinson, 1062 Salina, and again weaker out in the west. And then for wheat, in some cases it seems like you're if we're taking in so much corn at this point in time, our elevators anxious to bring in wheat right now, and when we have corn and soybeans and corn, sorghum, and soybeans on such an inflow at this time. But anyway, the prices that you have. It's interesting that Salina at 486, Hutchinson 481, 486 also, Topeka, and then a little weaker in the other parts. Well, again, 438, 441, 426 between Colby, Garden City, and Pittsburgh. We can't right now. It's a matter of regions and who has grain and where the grain's coming in strong at, and what areas of Kansas are livestock feeding oriented. Where are the ethanol plants at? And then where if we're going to send exports out of state, where's that? And a lot of that export, we look towards Topeka, Salina, Hutchinson, and Wellington, places like that for those type of signals.
And Daniel, these past few times, and even now, we've noted that an upcoming report is just about here, as it will come today. And what are some pre-report expectations that you think you'll see in the report?
Well, of course, here we're talking around a little after 10 o'clock. At 11 o'clock, the USDA crop production and WASI reports will be released. And long anticipated, of course, we had a September 12th report. We skipped the report in October because the government shut down. Well, now the government's open, and we're following through with the November report today. And pre-report expectations are interesting. I guess I'd say before we get into the numbers, there's more than usual possibility, a higher than usual possibility of surprises coming out of a report like this. Again, a bit more delayed. We have some pent up uncertainty, and if we get a surprise, say the corn yield number, that would be a big thing. We'd really be surprised at a soybean number. Talk about soybean yield, soybean production, and the same for corn. So the key numbers probably to look for would be the U.S. corn yield estimate. So we had a estimate in the September report of 186.7 bushels per acre, leading to 16.8 billion bushels. Pre-report expectations are that corn yields will be down, sharply, about little over 3 bushels an acre, down to 183.5, a range of 182 to 186. And that production would be closer to 16.5 billion bushels instead of 16.8 for corn. For beans, after looking at dry conditions in the Corn Belt in the eastern and central part of it, it's interesting that there's not much expectations that soybean yields will be lower. So maybe it's just my Western Corn Belt perspective impacting what I think is happening over there. But I wouldn't be surprised that although the market is expecting 53.3 bushels per acre and about 4.265 billion bushels of production, that there are questions about that, at least from my Western viewpoint. And lowest trade estimate for yields, 51.7 bushels an acre, 53.8 On the high side, it was 53 even for the yield in the September report. So we'll see on that. You put those two together, there's anticipation of tightening for corn, not much at all for soybeans. And of course, those supply numbers, those crop production numbers, lead right into the estimate for U.S. ending stocks. At this time, we came out of September, we had 2.11 billion bushels for ending stocks for U.S. corn for this 25-26 marketing year. Anticipated, or that was the number that was given. The market expects that to be about at that or higher. So we shall see. How is it consistent between having an expectation of lower production, then stocks to go higher? Well, you'd have to have some paring back of usage in some way. So we'll be looking at the ethanol usage numbers, the wet corn milling numbers, exports, and livestock feed use to try to reconcile all that. And then for soybeans, we had a USDA number in September of 300 million bushels of ending stocks for the 25-26 market year ending August 31st next year. Pre-report trade gas about 292 million bushels, so to be down some. So here you have with the yield and production figures unchanged for soybeans, but the ending stocks to be down a little bit. So again, we'll have to see how that reconciles between exports for beans, crush on the other, and see where all things go. So important time coming up. We don't counsel anybody to be too jumpy on situations like this, but all that much more what'll come out here at the top of the hour will really probably set the tone for direction of markets for the next several months. Again, and weigh heavily into sell now versus store decisions for most ag producers in Kansas.
Daniel, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much, Shelby. Take care.
That was K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show taking the time to reflect on maybe what your organization is doing and maybe how it could change in the future for Management Minute with K-State Extension Beef Cattle Specialist Justin Waggoner. Justin, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, good morning, Shelby.
Justin, as we're getting close to Thanksgiving, a great time to take the time to reflect back on yourself, but also maybe your business and organization. And why is that something that's really important to do?
Yeah, so I think that's, as you said it's really hard to believe that we're knocking on the door of Thanksgiving right now. The year is going to quickly be wrapping up. I often think of that in times of, a lot of organizations or businesses, it tends to be when we do employee evaluations, right? I know that's kind of how it is within our organization, but I also think that aspect of both personal reflection in terms of one's tasks, we talk about New Year's resolutions. Well, it can also be a good time for an organization to really take a step back, objectively look at, the organization as a whole. Are we healthy? Are there some things that are working well? And just kind of dive into that a little bit.
Is this important for organizations that are 1 and 2 people to maybe 50 to 100 people or even more?
Yeah, good question. I think that it does matter. Oftentimes in agriculture, which that's most of our listening audience here, operations come in different sizes and of all different scales. And so, as I think, many farming operations may have 2 to 3 employees. If you compare that to a larger like cattle feeding enterprise that I'm more familiar with and work with, that may have couple different departments. I do think it's a healthy process for even those smaller organizations to look at. I think it's harder in some respects when you're in a smaller organization, maybe to get a sense of some of these things, just because you're smaller, right? You can have a team meeting and it's 3 people. Whereas if you're a feed yard that has different departments, you likely have, 10 to 12 employees. Maybe you're large enough that there's 5 to 6 employees. There may be different teams and different operational units on an operation of that scale, but yes, I do think it's something that regardless of, the size of the operation or enterprise or business, I think it's a really good idea to just take a step back and reflect a little bit and maybe we can walk through some of the questions and that'll help the listeners kind of get a better sense of, maybe what we're talking about.
What do you have as some of those questions that you'd encourage people to use if they're looking to reflect?
Yeah, so this topic of organizational reflection, it gets talked a lot about. If you go online, there's some guides that you can walk through. I really think a good place to start is, start with some successes. As an organization, as a business, what did we succeed at? What did we do well? Did we have some goals that we had set in the prior year? If I think about a farming operation or something, those goals get a little goals in agriculture, right? Sometimes things happen, and we don't have a sales goal. We don't have things that other operational units would have. But I do think it's a good time to, kind of look and say, what were the successes? Here's the things that we did really well. I also think alternatively, we need to look at the other side of it and say, what did we not do well? Where are we failing at? And that may come, employee turnover, right? If we've had a lot of people leave a particular organization, or maybe it's just higher than normal, that's certainly something you want to be aware of. What's going on? Was that just due to just natural turnover? They moved, they got a better opportunity, or was that something that we really needed to pay more attention to? So I think talking about those successes, talking about those failures, looking at those, what did we learn? Dissecting those a little bit, diving into those a little bit deeper. The other side of that is, what would you like to do more of? What generated the most positive outcomes for the organizations? And here, I think about a farming operation, maybe their main focus is farming, but then they also have a small cattle operation. Are there opportunities there that maybe the cattle operation just really isn't working very well? Maybe we're just better at farming, right? Do we make that decision of, well, okay, maybe this is time for an enterprise shift? So you can use a little bit of the accounting, the management piece of that in there too. And that ties into that next question, what would you like to do more of, but what do you want to stop doing? Are there just some things that, it just doesn't work, right? Maybe that's, I'll use the example of a haying enterprise, right? You could hire that out. If you don't really have the bandwidth to be baling hay all night on your operation, maybe you'd be better off to look at outsourcing that. So I think there's some things like that you can, ask a few questions there. I would really just encourage anyone who's interested in this topic, go online. There's a large number of resources that would probably do a lot better job of tailoring it to your operation than what we can here just in this discussion.
And while we're thinking about reflecting, I feel like a lot of times we think about the financials and what we could have done differently there. But is it important to also reflect on what the culture of your organization is?
Absolutely. I think culture is, we talked a little about turnover. Culture is a big part of that. As a general, sense here, if you ask your employees, is this a good place to work? Is this, do you enjoy your job? Do you enjoy working here? That's also something we need to take note of because it carries over, right? And so I think one of the things about organizational culture and evaluating that, I mean, culture is really difficult to define, especially in an organization. Yes, there's structured academic definitions of what culture is. But I think if you really think about it, it's really intangible. And that's what makes it a little difficult to assess. I think the interesting thing about culture is when it's there and when it works, and no one talks about it. However, when culture or an organizational culture within a business, when it's not working, it's really the one thing that everybody kind of comes back to and says, wow, the culture's just broken, even though we struggle to define it, right? So I think that really speaks to, kind of the importance of culture, right? It's underlying, it's always there. When it works, it works. When it doesn't, we just know something's wrong. And so, if we come back to the classical definition of organizational culture, that academic thing, the shared attitudes, values, goals, practices, all those things that characterize that institution or organization. I think you can also break that definition down to a couple maybe key questions. Who we are and how do we get things done? How do we do the work, right? That's a pretty simple way of kind of, thinking about culture from my very simple perspective here.
From this Management Minute article, which I will link in today's show notes, it talks about how culture can be beneficial for maybe reducing something like employee turnover or people enjoying their time at work. And what are some of those metrics?
Yeah, so, one of the biggest things that I took away from the research that I do putting in these articles is, there was a quote in an article. I won't quote the article here, essentially, but directly, but one of the biggest failures of an organization is not recognizing their own talent, and culture is a big part of that. There's some Gallup data that's out there that basically looked at employee retention and burnout and those kind of things, and they essentially asked a survey question, said the employees who strongly agree with the statement, "I feel connected to my organization's culture," are 3.7 times as likely to be engaged in their work and 68% less likely to feel burned out. And so we know that when it comes to, employee retention and turnover, culture's a big part of that, right? And so I think that it certainly speaks to that importance of culture, and especially in terms of talent management and those type of things.
What's a good way for then people who are maybe doing this organizational culture reflection to gauge, how do my employees feel?
Yeah, good question. And I think that can be done, if there's a way to, do it anonymously, right? Independent, you want to get as honest a feedback as you can. And so I think one of the things that I took away from my article here is, you can define the culture of your organization very simply. And so asking, employees in a very genuine fashion can be, hey, describe the organization in one word. What is the best thing you like working about here in one word, right? Try to break it down into those one word, answers. And I think that can be a great way just to see, are they negative, are they positive, and really start to gauge a sense of where employees are really at.
Justin, do you feel like a shift in culture, if needed, happens quickly or usually takes some time?
Cultural change, good question. Wasn't something we necessarily covered in the article, but, I think a cultural shift, can be as simple as a leadership transition, right? That can be a very pivotal jumping off point. Other times, changing institutional and organizational culture is a tremendous undertaking. That is not something that is changed easily or overnight. So, I think it depends a little bit on the organization and maybe, what aspects of the culture need to change. If you've got a relatively healthy organization, but potentially maybe leadership just doesn't necessarily share some of those cultural values of the organization or leader, putting new leadership in place can be a great way to redirect that in a pretty healthy culture. In other places, maybe we don't have a healthy culture at the employee level. We just need a good leader, right, to bring all those pieces together. So, kind of great question, but I think there's some two ends of the spectrum there, if you will.
Justin, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
All right. Thanks, Shelby.
That was K-State Extension Beef Cattle Specialist Justin Waggoner. If you'd like to read more on this topic, there will be 2 articles linked in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Friday show with a weather update from K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Chip, currently experiencing warmer temperatures. However, that's not how we started the week.
No, we had a very cold weekend, and temperatures got down Sunday morning well below freezing for the whole state. In fact, a lot of the states saw teens. And we even saw a couple of readings of 10 degrees in northwest Kansas and in northeast Kansas. So winter finally kind of showed its face a little bit. We didn't break any records, but most of the records were in the single digits for this time of year and falling, obviously, as we move closer to peak winter time. And the cold was enough to push everything into dormancy. We saw the vegetation start to get cured out, all the grasses and leaves. It didn't snow this weekend, but there was talk of flurry, especially in the eastern part of the state. But most of the snow stayed well clear of Kansas and Iowa and Illinois. We did have things falling from the sky. That was the leaves. The leaves were all falling from the trees after that freeze, and it looked like snowfall. And it even blew around a little bit, too. And so we're starting to get drifts of leaves like we typically see in some of the cities where there's more trees. But definitely a sign that, fall is now kind of complete. Now we're really starting to open that door into winter. And we look at climatology. First snows are typically within the next 2 weeks or so for much of the state, except for the far southeast, where we can start to see some pretty impactful snowstorms if we were to get the right weather pattern. Obviously, that's not in the question right now. We've warmed up significantly since this weekend. Temperatures we were about 20 degrees below normal over the weekend, and now we're about 20 degrees above normal. Running temperatures near the 80 plus degree mark, and actually have broken some records, high temperatures this week. And that kind of turns out to be the bigger story as we look at overall trends. November starting to trend on that, definitely on that warmer side.
A lot of times when we talk about the fall, you also mention windy or breezy conditions. Did we see any of that?
Yeah, winds were pretty gusty this weekend. We had some gusts up to 40, 45 miles an hour with that front. We had a couple sprinkles too. But honestly, once that cold front moved off to our east, it's been pretty quiet across the state. Winds have been breezy every once in a while. We'll see a gust of 15 to 20, especially in the western part of the state. But overall, winds have been pretty calm and quiet, considering we're still kind of in our second peak of windiest season.
What can we be expecting when we look ahead?
So we got several more cold fronts. It seems like we are getting cold fronts. They're just really, really weak. We're going to have one Friday night and Saturday that'll bring a little bit cooler weather on Saturday after record warmth on Friday. And then really feel warm back up to Saturday. And then another more potent front moves in on Monday. It looks like that low is going to track right over the state. So some concerns for fire weather in the southwestern part of the state with gusty southwest winds and low humidities. That'll just be for Sunday. There will be some folks along the Missouri border and maybe in far northeast Kansas and southeast Kansas see some rain showers. I don't really think it's going to be a big rainmaker. It'll bring in milder air. Close to normal. Normals are somewhere in the upper 50s with lows near the 30-degree mark. And then a transition in the pattern occurs midweek next week, and we start to see an atmospheric river event for the southwestern United States into California. And that's just that whole weather pattern we've talked before about. As you go into winter, I expect this jet stream to shift south, and that will allow us another opportunity for moisture. It does look like above normal precipitation is favored for the last week and a half of November as that pattern change undergoes. And we could potentially see that as early as late next week. But I think right now that will get pushed off a little bit. But we're going to see windows of opportunity for some moisture towards the end of the month. That'll likely bring in some cooler air to end November and to start December.
Chip, you mentioned we're going to see some moisture probably at the end of the month. That moisture coming in rain or snow?
Oh, that's a loaded question right there. Still no real sign of much below average cold air building. Like we saw colder than normal temperatures this weekend, but that was a quick hit and move on. And I just don't see any really long duration cold. So overall, we're likely going to see it in the form of warm precipitation, rainfall, with no real winter impacts expected, maybe until we get into early December.
Chip, I appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.